Today, we become legends.
Yep, you read that right. This tier list is arguably the best we're going to get for an objective tier list for ranked play in Smite. This one may look a little different to what you've seen before, and that's because each god is rated at a numerical value between 0 and 10 based on their overall power level and ability to win in ranked. This numerical value is the result of many different pro players' opinions on each god in the game, all averaged out. So for example, if Kibo was rated a 10 by one player, 5 by another, and 0 by a third player, that would result in an overall average score of 5. Just a hypothetical, of course. Kibo is way higher than 5 on this tier list. Each tier is actually ordered from left to right, with the strongest god with the highest score in that tier being on the left, and the weakest with the lowest score in that tier being on the right. This data was gathered by me, probably being a huge nuisance to pro players on Twitter and Discord, asking them to fill out a Google Forms response for a number between 0 and 10 for each god. Then of course those results were added up and divided by the number of responses to get an average value for every single god. I also have a few other tier lists from the community to compare this to afterwards and see how it compares as like an objective opinion, in massive air quotes, compared to like other tier lists made by individuals in the community. But enough of that setup, let's get into this tier list. So the first thing that strikes me as really interesting with this tier list is that Rama is rated as the best god in the game by the pro players that responded to this survey. Obviously this wasn't every pro player, but I got a decent variety of roles. I feel like it wasn't just like a whole bunch of ADC mains that all rated Rama super high. It was actually like a decent variety of roles, so I think this is reasonably accurate. But Rama being the best god in the game is very interesting. He's also risen to like huge prominence in the meta recently. It's understandable to see him rated very high, but best god in the game is something I didn't expect when I was collecting this data. Kibo is also pretty highly rated. For me, I'm fine with Kibo being this high. I rate Kibo very high myself, but I feel like a lot of other people wouldn't rate Kibo top 5 gods in the game, but that's the result we've got from this objective pro player tier list. The other 3 gods in this tier make a lot of sense. I think everyone agrees Amaterasu, Yamoja, and Nemesis are some of the top gods in the game right now. And since these tiers are all like score based, I guess you could say 9 to 10 is S+, 8 to 9 is S, 7 to 8 is A+, 6 to 7 is A, 5 to 6 is B+, 4 to 5 is B, 3 to 4 is C, and 2 to 3 is D. That's probably what it would like correspond to roughly on like a normal letter based tier list. But yeah, in the 8 to 9 category, we have Olorun, Persephone, Jingwei, Freya, Cupid, Kali, which is interesting, Thor, Kuzenbo, Aphrodite, Merlin, Morrigan, and Erlangchen. So some notable ones from this category for me are Erlangchen and Kali. I feel like these two are rated much higher than most people would place them. Kali, similar to Kibo, is a god that I always rate very highly on tier lists for carrying and ranked. So it makes sense, but I feel like a lot of people would rate Kali a bit lower than this. And Erlangchen is just a surprise all around. I feel like no individual would really rate Erlangchen like one of the super top gods in the game, but that's where he's rated. The rest of the tier makes mostly sense. I mean, Olorun, Persephone, Jingwei, Freya, Cupid. I don't think anyone's arguing these aren't like top tier. And obviously, as I said earlier, these tiers are ordered from left to right as well as like up to down. So like Olorun is like the top end of this tier, Erlangchen is the bottom end of this tier. And also, how I've done this is they're like 7 to 8 and 8 to 9. If they're exactly an 8.0, they're put in the 8 to 9 tier. So like if they're bang on the boundary, they're put in like the higher tier. So Erlangchen is probably like an 8.0. I don't have his exact value here, but like he'd be the lower end of that. Whereas Olorun is probably something like, you know, an 8.8 or an 8.9 or something like right on the upper end of that tier. Moving down to 7 to 8, which would roughly be the equivalent of A+, we have some pretty interesting ones down here, I feel like. I feel like a lot of people would rate Haim, Cthulhu, Ula, Hercules, Bacca, and maybe Mercury, like quite a bit higher than this. Some of these are like pretty low. Like for me, I would definitely rate Cthulhu a lot higher. But based on the pro players that were surveyed for this, Cthulhu actually not that good, apparently. You know, like Cthulhu rated lower than Kuzenbo, rated lower than, well, lower than Amaterasu kind of makes sense. She's pretty strong, but yeah, Cthulhu rated like lower than Sobek, for example. That's pretty interesting. I think I would definitely rate Cthulhu higher than Sobek myself. Ula and Haim for me as well. I think Ula and Haim are some of the top ADCs. Like, I don't think I would argue that Haim and Ula are like stronger than the top 4 of like Rama, Olorun, Freya, Cupid. I think those are like a solid top 4 ADCs that most people agree on, but Haim being rated lower than Hachiman and Ula being rated lower than Hachiman and Huyi, I feel like they're stronger than Hachiman and Huyi, in my opinion, but that's how it's come out in this data. Hercules as well, I would definitely rate Hercules a lot higher than they've rated him here. Based on this tier, he's probably somewhere around like a 7.4-ish out of 10. Whereas I would probably rate Hercules like a 9 or something. I think Hercules would be like bottom end of this top tier here, or maybe in the 8 to 9 category, if it was based on my opinion only. Moving on to 6 to 7, which is basically the balanced tier. So an interesting thing from this tier is that Anubis is rated pretty highly. He's rated higher than like Ra, Isis, Baron Samedi, like a lot of other decent mid laners, which I actually agree with. I think Anubis is very underrated. I feel like people say Anubis is the worst god in the game. He's really not in terms of like carrying for ranked. If this was an SPL based tier list, which is not, I specifically specified to the pro players that were responding to this that this is for ranked. It's not an SPL tier list. And so I think that's probably why Anubis is a little higher. I think if I had said if it was based solely on SPL, Anubis would have tanked down to like maybe 3 or 4 or 4 to 5. But yeah, Anubis in ranked is actually just solid. Like, you can get away with him, you can play him mid, you can play him jungle, and honestly, it's not that bad. Wukong rated pretty low here. I feel like a lot of people would rate Wukong as one of the top 3 or at least the top 5 solo laners, but he's actually below a lot of different solo laners here, like below King Arthur, below Achilles. So it's pretty interesting to see Wukong be this low, and I feel like a lot of people right now have a pretty high opinion of Wukong. Xbalanque is pretty high as well. I've seen a lot of people rate Xbalanque as one of the worst ADCs in the game. I personally don't agree with that. I think he still has like some pretty good hypercarry potential. So I think this is a pretty good place to put him actually, but a lot of people rate Xbalanque pretty low. Camazotz obviously has fallen from grace. I don't think anyone really thinks Camazotz is like a super top solo laner anymore, or jungler. So it kind of makes sense to see him here. The rest of this tier is actually pretty fine in my opinion. There's a lot of like pretty balanced culprits here, you know, like a lot of these mid laners, Nuwa, Scylla, Agni, Cuckoo, Vulcan, Anubis, these are all like pretty balanced mid laners in my opinion. And like Rat, Susano, Thanatos, all balanced junglers, Kukulkan, pretty balanced solo laner I would say. So yeah, overall I think this is a pretty good tier, other than I would probably rate Wukong a bit higher. But in general, this tier makes a lot of sense to me. I think this one's pretty fair. Moving on to the 5 to 6 category, which is basically your equivalent of B+. We have some pretty usual culprits down here, like AMC, Anher, Skadi. Discordia being down in 5 to 6 is very interesting. I'm honestly down for this opinion. I feel like people overrate Discordia a lot, but I feel like most people would put Discordia at least in like 7 to 8. I've seen a lot of people argue Discordia as a top 5 mid laner, which means she should be like 8 to 9. So it's pretty interesting to see Discordia so low here, but I actually do agree with this placement a lot. Kumba I think is underrated here. I think Kumba should be a little higher, at least 1 tier higher. I'm actually kind of a fan of Kumba in the current meta. I feel like he does pretty well at shutting down a lot of the immobile gods and also a lot of the auto attack based gods. I feel like Kumba's pretty strong. But the rest of this tier seems fine. I think Ra's a bit underrated. I'd move Ra up a little bit if this was my personal opinion, but the rest are honestly pretty fine. Maybe Geb and Khepri a little bit low, but I guess if it's for carrying ranks, Geb and Khepri don't really carry ranks. If it was SPL, they'd probably be a bit higher. In the 4 to 5 category, which is basically your equivalent of B tier, we have some pretty interesting ones like Kronos and Sol being down here. Obviously, they're kind of bad gods in themselves, but you'd think Ring of Hecate being in the game would put them up a couple of tiers. But yeah, the pro players that were surveyed really don't rate these gods, even with Ring of Hecate being so strong. Nike being down here makes sense since the Sunder nerf. Sad as it is, I agree with Bellona being down here. Bellona just doesn't really do anything in the current meta. Like, she kind of wins lane, but even in some matchups, she doesn't really win lane that hard. And if you're not winning lane super hard as Bellona, what are you doing? Yeah, the rest of this tier makes a lot of sense to me. Dashi's kind of bad. Izanami, Apollo, pretty bad ADCs. Nox, pretty trash. Chak doesn't really do anything. Cernunnos may be a little underrated here. I'd probably move Cernunnos up slightly, but for the most part, I agree with this tier. Moving down to 3 to 4, which will be your equivalent of a C tier. We have Artemis, makes sense. Baron, severely underrated here in my opinion. I think Baron is a lot stronger than what is rated here. Obviously, it's tough to argue with like several different pro player opinions saying Baron's bad. Like, that's the thing with this tier list. It's tough to argue against it because it's like a bunch of different pro players all collating that Baron is a bad god. But for me, I feel like Baron is pretty good. Like, I'd probably move Baron up to like a balanced tier, like maybe 6 to 7. I feel like, or at least 5 to 6. I feel like Baron can sort of do a bit of work. I don't think he belongs with like Loki, Serket, Artemis. But aside from the anomaly of Baron, I completely agree with the rest of this tier. Like Artemis, Serket, Odin, Loki, Arwash, Zeus, Bastet. These are all culprits of being very low tier gods. And then finally we have the 2 to 3 category, just Fenrir on his lonesome down here. Fenrir was the lowest score in the entire tier list. I think he had a 2.2. So this isn't even like, you know, oh, he's almost in 3 to 4. He's actually at the bottom end of 2 to 3. So by a severe margin, I think Bastet was maybe like a 3.2. So by like an entire point, Fenrir is the worst god in the game, according to pro players. So it makes sense why we're seeing some buffs on Fenrir in the coming patches. And for those who are curious, the very best god in the game on this tier list, according to the pro players, Rama, was rated at 9.6. Actually, nobody rated Rama lower than a 9. It was all 10s or 9s in terms of ratings for Rama, and that averaged out to a 9.6. But yeah, this is pretty interesting. I feel like this is sort of, you know, because when people make tier lists, they sort of try and bend their opinions to what other people think, so that their tier lists aren't like, you know, called out for being trash or whatever. But this is like a completely anonymous, honest opinion from pro players. So I feel like this tier list, we have a lot that we could learn from this, because this is just a pro player's opinion, completely raw and unfiltered, because it's completely anonymous. You know, they have no reason to say anything other than exactly what they believe. And it has come out with some interesting anomalies that most people probably wouldn't have put in certain places, like Kali being pretty high, Rama being the best god in the game, Fenrir being by far the worst god in the game, like way below Loki and Bastet and stuff like that. So yeah, I think the whole anonymous thing and the fact that they don't have to tailor their opinions to like the meta or whatever is actually come out with some really interesting responses here. Like Cthulhu being so low as well is another one that's really interesting. But yeah, I also have a couple of other tier lists from the community up here that I want to compare this to. So this first one is Wukong's most recent tier list, which was on the same patch as I sent this survey out to the pro players. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, Tsukuyomi was rated in this survey, but he wasn't available on this Smite tier list website because it's not been updated for his patch yet. But Tsukuyomi was rated at an 8.2, so it would be somewhere around where like Afro, Merlin, Mori, Erlang, around there is where Tsukuyomi will be rated by the pros. Okay, back to this. So this is Wukong's most recent tier list. And we can kind of compare the two, see where there's similarities, see where there's differences. So obviously the big difference being Cthulhu. I've mentioned this before. Cthulhu on this objective pro player tier list rated very low compared to what a lot of people would rate him individually. Like Wukong has him as one of the top 4 gods in the game. Khepri also is Khepri and Ganesh for the most part. Like Khepri and Ganesh are what, like Ganesha is 6 to 7, Khepri is 5 to 6, and Wukong has them as like S tier gods. So that's pretty interesting. A big difference there. Discordia also pretty low on the other tier list, pretty high on this one. Arachne and Baka a little overrated on Wukong's tier list compared to this one. And obviously I'm not saying this one is the correct tier list and everyone should follow this tier list. I'm just saying this is like an unfiltered opinion from a bunch of different pros averaged out. So obviously, you know, these gods don't necessarily have accurate ratings. You know, you could have a couple of pro players rating them like 10 out of 10. You could have a couple of pro players rating them 0 out of 10. And it can kind of skew the results. But this is probably like the most accurate we're going to get overall as an opinion from the pros. Kibo's a really interesting one. Kibo rated as one of the top 5 gods in the game on the objective tier list and A tier, just like balanced. One of the like probably bottom half on Wukong's tier list. Pretty interesting there. Aphrodite rated very low when Afro's still rated pretty high on this one. She's not like top 10, but she's close to top 10. Kali, similar to Aphrodite, rated in like A tier here, but rated pretty highly on the tier list. And if we go look at the bottom tiers, Loki and Odin makes sense. Guan is rated as like one of the bottom 2 gods in the game by Wukong. Honestly, reasonable. I mean, how many is this? Yeah, Guan is bottom 10 according to this tier list, so yeah, pretty reasonable there. But obviously, we do have Fenrir being rated higher than like Odin, Guan, and Loki, and Fenrir on the objective tier list, or like the averaged out tier list, is by far the worst god in the game. Alright, moving on. This next one is, I believe, Duke's Lost tier list. Duke's Lost most recent tier list for patch 7.8 or 7.9. I can't remember which one. It might have been like a cross-patch tier list. Tsukuyomi, Olaron, Armor, Cupid, Freya, Nemesis, Arachne. So other than Arachne, these top tiers are like pretty fair. I mean, these are mostly gods that you would see in the 8 to 9, but there's some from 9 to 10, right? There's Amaterasu, Nemesis, kind of up there. I don't think Duke's Lost had a higher tier than this. The S tier was like his highest. So Arachne a little bit overrated based on this tier list. Where does Arachne hide on this one? Yeah, Arachne's in the 5 to 6 category, so a lot of pro players really don't rate Arachne that high, and it's probably because they play in like super high level ranked where Arachne can't pub stomp, whereas like a Duke's Lost probably more like an average player, like, you know, gold, maybe low plat or something. And so like Arachne being rated higher on his tier list does make sense, because for like the average player, Arachne is probably a lot better than it is for like the pro players. Set and Hades rated very highly here when they were rated quite low here. Set was 5 to 6, Hades was 6 to 7. Cuchulainn probably overrated a little bit. Neith very overrated. Poseidon very overrated. Anubis very overrated. Because like Anubis is probably like top 25, just like based on my glance here. And like Anubis was obviously here for this tier list, which is honestly still pretty high. Like I feel like a lot of people rate Anubis as like one of the bottom 20 gods in the game, which just isn't true in my opinion. So I do agree with Duke's Lost here, but I think it's rated a little too high on his tier list. So Duke's Lost kind of just like wanged half the cast into the A tier, which is a bit confusing. Like, are all these gods the exact same power level, or like very similar power levels? But where's he put Fenrir? Yeah, Fenrir is in B, so it makes sense. You know, obviously I think Fenrir should probably be in C based on this tier list, but overall not too bad. You know, Fenrir, Bastet, Loki, Zeus, the usual culprits down in the bottom tiers, makes a lot of sense. King Arthur rated pretty low when King Arthur's rated as like actually probably top 20, maybe top 30 actually, gods in the game here in the 7 to 8 category. But for the most part, Duke's Lost low tiers are pretty accurate. Like he has Fenrir, he has Aquash, he has Nox, he has Loki, Bastet, Zeus, all that kind of stuff, Serket. Like all the low tiers here make a lot of sense aside from mostly King Arthur and Morrigan. Morrigan obviously rated pretty high here. Morrigan in the 8 to 9 category. Just based on this, she's probably like an 8.2 or something like that. So, yeah, Mori rated super low on Duke's Lost tier list for some reason. Maybe it's just because, like, in low ranks, Mori's kind of, like, a lot harder to make work, where, like, the pro players can really make her work effectively, so that's why she's rated a lot higher here. And then, yeah, obviously Duke's Lost has just jammed, like, more than half the gods into A tier, so it's kind of difficult to evaluate a lot of these, but, yeah, he's got a lot of gods, like, as just balanced. Whereas, like, this tier list has, you know, maybe, like, I'd say these two tiers, 6 to 7 and 5 to 6, are sort of, like, the balanced gods. But let's move on to our final one here, which is actually the Reddit Smite community tier list. This one should be pretty interesting. This is actually a very similar method to what I did to collect my data, except this one is from like the average Reddit user instead of the average pro player for this tier list. So it should be interesting to see how the average opinion of pro players compares to the average opinion of a Reddit user. Obviously, Tsukuyomi rated as by far the best god in the game. That's just Reddit crying about an overpowered release. Tsukuyomi's not really the best god in the game, in my opinion. And obviously, this tier list, Tsukuyomi is rated at an 8.2, so it would be somewhere around here, around Merlin and Morrigan. So obviously, Tsukuyomi rated insanely high on the Smite Reddit tier list here. Cthulhu, Freya, Olorun. Obviously, I kind of agree with these. I think Cthulhu is one of the better gods in the game, but obviously on this tier list, Cthulhu is actually way down here, which is a very interesting one. This is probably one of the most interesting picks overall from this. So the next tier, looking pretty solid. This is probably about how I do it. Maybe like a ranking a little bit down, but yeah, Baka rated a little lower on this tier list than the average Reddit user, and obviously Arachne rated way down here. There's, like I've discussed before, I think it's mostly because pro players know how to play around Arachne and she doesn't pub stomp quite as hard in high level ranked. Obviously Rama rated at a 4.79 out of 7, which is like probably roughly the equivalent of maybe like a 7.5 to an 8 on like an out of 10 scale like mine is, but obviously Rama rated a 9.6 on this tier list. So Rama, by far the best god in the game according to the pro players that were surveyed for this, but according to Smite Reddit, not quite as strong. The Izanami pick is interesting. This really just shows that like the average Smite Reddit user really has no idea how to play the game. Same thing with Rat really, and Hades. Like Hades, Rat, Izanami, they're all like kind of gods that sort of pub stomp, but aren't actually that strong, and Reddit rates them super highly because of that. But obviously on this tier list we have Izanami super like way down here. We have Rat in a pretty balanced state, which I think Rat is absolutely fine. He's not like a top tier jungler, but you can definitely make him work. But like Izanami's way down here in this tier list, which makes sense. Izanami's not that good of a god. She just kind of pub stomps people that don't know how to deal with her wave clear and pressure. And that's probably the average Smite Reddit user, so that's why this is like this. And then obviously Hades. Everyone thinks Hades is super good. I'm not on the Hades hype train, dude. I think he's just fair, as he always has been. He wins lane super hard, but then kind of falls off. And I guess it's basically a similar thing to Izanami, where like they can't deal with his wave clear and pressure early on, and they kind of just get stomped out of the game by him before they can really come back into the game. Yeah, Hades on this tier list is in 6 to 7, which is like probably just like the A tier, pretty balanced, which I think is pretty reasonable for him. I think he's a pretty balanced god. Let's have a look at a few of the lower tiers. So Loki being by far the worst god in the game. I think I probably would have agreed with this prior to seeing this tier list, but honestly, thinking about how bad Fenrir is and how you never see him and how no one really makes him work, I honestly kind of agree that Fenrir is the worst god in the game. So yeah, where's Fenrir on this tier list? Yeah, Fenrir is rated pretty low, so good job Smite Reddit. Your low tiers are actually pretty good. All of these gods, Guan, Bastet, Artemis, Fenrir, Nox, Aquash, Loki, are all like pretty low tier on this tier list as well. So for the low tiers, Smite Reddit actually not too bad. But for the high tiers, they have some pretty severe misses there. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. I think it's really interesting to sort of have a look at what we can learn from this tier list, based on that it's like, I mean, this is mostly for high ranked, right? Because all the pro players are going to be playing in like at least Masters, probably GM a lot of the time. So like this is for very high level ranked, and it makes sense why some of the picks are different to, for example, like the Smite Reddit tier list or the Duke's Lost tier list, which I think represent the average player a lot better. You know, where like Izanami and Hades were rated super high. Duke's Lost, I think, had Anubis like super high on his tier list, and Rat and stuff like that, which are all like kind of pub stompy gods that just win early game, and if you can't deal with them, you're kind of screwed. But like as you get higher and you get better at the game, you get a lot better at sort of dealing with these like early pressure gods and stuff like that. And they come down a lot in this tier list because obviously the pro players are the best of the best. They know how to deal with cheese strats like Anubis and Izanami, so they don't really rate them as high. But yeah, honestly, the best god in the game and the worst god in the game are two that I probably would not have expected. I probably would have rated either Yamoja or Arma, maybe Hebo, or maybe even Nemesis as the top god in the game. Possibly even Cthulhu will be in that discussion for me. But yeah, Rama being the best god in the game by a decent margin is pretty interesting. And obviously Fenrir by a wide margin being the worst god, that is not something I expected. I would have rated either Loki or Bastet probably as the worst gods in the game. But yeah, Fenrir is at 2.2, and let me find Bastet actually. I want to see how far behind Bastet Fenrir actually is. So Bastet is actually a 3.0, so Fenrir is 0.8 score behind, which is like a big jump. Like most of the jumps between single gods here, like they're either the same score or they're down by like 0.1 or 0.2. And the difference between Bastet and the worst god in the game being Fenrir is 0.8, which is like a very big jump. Like, Fenrir is by far the worst god in the game according to the pro players that were surveyed for this, which I think is pretty interesting. I would not have put Fenrir as the worst god in the game myself. And obviously a lot of other people haven't either based on the tier list we've looked at today. But yeah, I just thought this would be a pretty interesting video to do where it's kind of like a quote objective tier list from like the pro players. Because like they can be completely anonymous with it. Obviously, take this with a grain of salt, because as I said, this probably isn't too representative of the average player, because most of the pro players are going to be playing in Masters and GMs. So if you're a Masters / GM player, this is probably very representative of the meta for you. But if you're playing in Silver or Gold, don't take this too much to heart. You don't have to play one of these 5 gods to win if you're in Silver and Gold. You could probably play Fenrir and win if you're in Gold. Like, it doesn't really matter all that much. But it is still an interesting thing to look at, and we can learn a lot from this based on like how the pro players think about the game. And if you are in the higher ranks, like if you're in Diamond Plus, I think you can make good use of this tier list actually. So I think it's pretty interesting. Obviously, like I said, take it with a grain of salt. Not every rating is going to be like completely 100% accurate, because it wasn't every pro player surveyed, and obviously it was only pro players. It wasn't like the average player surveyed here. But yeah, like I said, take this with a grain of salt. Leave your guys' thoughts down below. You know, like some picks like I've been pointing out with like Fenrir or Rama, some picks that surprised you that you didn't think would be rated so low or so high, for example, on this tier list. And I'll catch you guys later. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.